This is my true story. I worked all my life to give my son wealth, comfort, and even the mansion he flaunted. I thought in my old age he would give me respect. But one evening, during a gathering with his friends, I asked him softly for a glass of water. Instead of kindness, he sneered and said, "Beg for it, old man." Laughter filled the room while I lowered my head in shame. What he forgot was the mansion was still mine to control. And what I did next erased his pride forever. Before I continue, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is right now. And please subscribe. All my life was built on sacrifice. From the time I was young, I knew that hard work was the only way to build a future. I did not inherit riches. I did not have anyone to guide me through life. What I had were my hands, my back, and a heart that would not give up. I worked sunrise to sunset, day after day, season after season, building piece by piece the life I wanted for my family. I told myself that no matter how hard it became for me, my son would never know the same hunger, the same fear, the same empty nights I once knew. I labored in the fields, my shoulders burning from carrying loads too heavy for one man. I took jobs in the cold, in the heat, in the rain, never caring about myself, only thinking of the future I was building. Each coin I saved, each dollar I earned, I placed aside, imagining the day my son would use it for schooling, for security, for a better life. My body was often tired, my clothes worn, but my heart carried pride, knowing I was laying bricks of sacrifice into walls of stability for him. When he was still a boy, I gave him everything I could. New shoes when mine were falling apart. Warm meals when I ate scraps. A safe bed when I slept on floors after long shifts. I wanted him to feel cared for, wanted, safe. I'd carried him on my shoulders when his legs grew tired. I carried water on my back so he would never thirst. Every time he reached out, I was there. Every time he cried, I came running. His tears were my command, his comfort, my only reward. As he grew older, my sacrifices did not stop. I paid for his schooling, ensuring he had books, clothes, and all the tools to stand proudly among his peers. I worked extra hours to cover tuition, sometimes leaving before sunrise and coming back after dark. I smiled through my exhaustion, telling myself it was worth it. Every diploma he earned was a victory not just for him, but for me too, because I knew I had built the path beneath his feet. Later, when it was time for him to step into adulthood, I gave him more than words of advice. I gave him the very wealth I had built with my blood and sweat. I bought him a mansion, a place to live, to be proud of, to show the world that he came from something. I told myself it would keep him safe, give him comfort, and remind him of me when I was gone. That mansion, those walls, that roof, every brick in it carried a piece of my sacrifice. It was not just a house. It was my lifetime of labor made solid, standing tall. And I did not stop there. I set up accounts in his name, placed savings aside for him, ensured that if life ever grew difficult, he would not suffer as I had. I built him a future, thinking one day he would look at me with gratitude, with respect, with love. I believed old age would bring care, not cruelty. I believed that the years I gave to him would return as kindness in my last days. That was my dream. That was my sacrifice. Everything I had, everything I earned, everything I saved, I poured into him. I thought I had given him not only wealth, but also values, respect, compassion, dignity. I thought he would honor me as I had honored him all his life. But I was wrong. The change in my son did not happen in one night. It came slowly, like a shadow stretching longer with each sunset. At first, I did not notice. He had his friends, his gatherings, his business. I told myself he was simply busy, that age had made me sensitive. But little by little, I began to see it clearly. The respect in his voice was gone. The warmth in his eyes had faded. In its place, there was arrogance, cold, sharp, and growing stronger each day. He no longer asked for my advice. When I tried to speak, he interrupted me, brushed my words aside like dust. When I reminded him of lessons I had learned through hardship, he laughed as if I were a child speaking nonsense. My wisdom, built from decades of sacrifice, meant nothing to him. To him, I was only an old man in a chair, someone to be tolerated, not respected. I noticed it in the way he spoke about the mansion too. He called it his house, showing it off to his friends as if he had built it with his own hands. He boasted about its size, its beauty, its worth, never once mentioning who had given it to him. It was as if my years of work had been erased, as if the mansion had appeared from thin air for his comfort alone. Each time he spoke that way, my heart sank deeper. He was not proud of me. He was proud of himself, and he wanted the world to see me only as a burden, never as the builder of his world. But the arrogance grew further still. He stopped hiding his disregard in private. He began to show it openly, in front of others. When friends visited, he would mock my slow movements, joke about my trembling hands, laugh about my wheelchair as if it were a clown's prop. They laughed too, not because they hated me, but because they followed his lead. Every laugh echoed in my ears like hammers, each one striking the respect I thought I still carried. I sat in silence many times, my eyes lowered, my chest heavy, listening to him use me as a source of entertainment. He had forgotten that the same man he mocked had once carried him in arms, once shielded him from storms, once worked until bones ached so he could live without fear. He forgot everything, and in its place grew arrogance, fed by wealth he did not earn, by pride he did not deserve. That was when I knew something inside him had changed. He no longer saw me as a father. He saw me as weakness, as weight, as a nuisance to his pride. And each day, his arrogance grew louder, sharper, and crueler. The day that broke me came during what should have been an ordinary evening. My son had invited his friends to the mansion. The house echoed with their laughter, the sound of glasses clinking, the smell of food I had no part in. I sat quietly in the corner of the living room, in my chair, keeping out of the way. I did not want to disturb them. I only wanted to feel like I was still part of a home I had built with my sacrifice. My throat was dry, and my hands trembled. So I spoke softly, almost a whisper, and asked my son for a glass of water. He stopped, turned to me, and in front of all his friends, he smirked. His eyes narrowed with cruelty I had never seen before. Then he raised his voice, louder than mine, sharp enough for everyone to hear. "Beg for it, old man." The room froze for a moment, and then laughter erupted. His friends laughed, clapping their hands, shaking their heads, entertained by my humiliation. My son stood proud, his chest out, his smirk wide, as if mocking me gave him strength, as if denying me water made him powerful. I lowered my eyes, my throat burning not only from thirst but from shame. My lips trembled, but no words came out. I could not beg. I would not beg. But in that silence, the laughter grew louder, echoing off the walls of the mansion I had bought. I felt my heart break in that moment. My own son, the boy I once carried water for on my back during hot summers, was now denying me a single glass. The same boy whose lips I once wiped when he spilled, whose cries I once answered at midnight, whose thirst I once quenched before my own. Now he stood mocking me, making my weakness a spectacle. I remembered carrying heavy buckets when I was young, walking miles so he would never go thirsty. And now, here I was, being forced to lower my head in front of strangers for the same water I had once poured into his hands freely. I stayed silent. My hands gripped the arms of my chair, my throat dry, my eyes wet. I swallowed the pain, but it cut me deeper than any wound my body had ever taken. This was not just about water. This was about dignity. This was about respect. And that day, my son stripped me of both in front of people who did not even know me. That was the cruel scene. The moment where love turned into mockery. The moment where sacrifice was erased by laughter. The moment where a father became nothing more than a joke to his own child. After that cruel night, I sat in silence. My throat was still dry, but it was not water I longed for anymore. It was respect. It was dignity. And both had been denied to me in front of strangers. I sat in my chair while his friends laughed, their voices echoing in my ears long after they had left. Every chuckle, every smirk, every mocking glance felt like stones thrown at me. But the heaviest stone came from my son's laughter. That sound cut me deeper than anything I had felt in my long life. I kept my head down, but inside my mind was loud. Memories came rushing in. I remembered carrying buckets of water when I was younger, heavy loads that cut into my shoulders, walking long miles in the sun so my son would never thirst. I remembered pouring water into his small hands, watching him drink with a smile. I remembered telling myself, as I wiped his lips, that my life's work was to protect him from hardship. Yet the same child I once shielded now made me beg for the very thing I once gave freely. The humiliation burned hotter with every memory. I thought of nights when he was sick, when I sat awake beside him, holding a glass of water to his lips, praying he would recover. I thought of mornings when I went thirsty at work, just so he could have clean water to drink at home. And now, that same son demanded that I beg before giving me a drop. The love I once poured into him had been turned into mockery. I stayed silent, not because I agreed, but because I knew words would mean nothing to him. He had already chosen arrogance over respect. If I had spoken, he would have laughed louder. If I had begged, he would have mocked me more. So I sat still, swallowing my pain, letting the silence protect what little dignity I had left. But that silence was heavy. It sat in my chest, pressing down until I could barely breathe. That night, when I was alone again, I let the tears come. Not loud sobs, just quiet streams down my face. I cried not only for the humiliation, but for the truth it revealed. My sacrifices meant nothing to him. My years of carrying him, feeding him, protecting him had been forgotten. My value to him was not father, not provider, not protector. In his eyes, I was only an old man to be laughed at. That was the silent humiliation, the kind that does not scream but sinks deep, the kind that eats at the soul, the kind that makes a man realize he is no longer seen as human in the eyes of the one he loves most. As I sat alone with my humiliation, another thought came to me, a truth my son had completely forgotten. He acted as if the mansion was his, as if he owned every wall, every brick, every piece of ground it stood on. He walked through the halls with pride, showing it off to his friends, speaking of it as his property. He believed it was already his forever. But he was blind to the truth. The mansion was never his. It was mine. The deed, the title, the legal rights, all of it still carried my name. I remembered the day I bought that mansion. It was not luck, it was not handed to me. It was years of labor, years of sacrifice, years of bending my back until it nearly broke. Every coin I saved, every debt I paid, every hardship I endured built that home. I put it under his care, but I never let go of ownership. I thought I was protecting him. I thought I was being wise. I thought keeping the title in my name would shield him from making mistakes too early. And now that decision, made in love, stood before me like a weapon of justice. He laughed at me for asking for water, but he forgot the papers in the drawer that bore my name. He mocked my weakness, but he forgot that power does not come from laughter. It comes from control. He believed the mansion was his pride, but he did not know it was still mine to give, mine to take, mine to erase. As I thought about it, my pain began to turn into clarity. He could humiliate me in front of his friends. He could laugh at my frailty. He could deny me dignity in a room full of strangers. But he could not change the truth written in ink. The law still saw me as the owner. His arrogance blinded him to the fact that I was still the master of that house, the keeper of its walls, the one who decided its future. That was the forgotten truth. He believed his cruelty had stripped me of everything, but it had not. My body was weak, my voice was quiet, but my authority was still strong. The mansion, the symbol of his pride, the fortress of his arrogance, still belonged to me. And I knew then that I could take it from him as easily as he took my dignity. That night, I did not sleep. I lay awake in my chair, the darkness pressing around me like a heavy blanket, my mind racing with thoughts I could not silence. My body was tired, my throat still dry, but it was not thirst that kept me awake. It was humiliation. It was the sound of laughter echoing in my ears, laughter that came not from strangers, but from my own son. I could still see the smirk on his face, the look of pride as he made me beg for water. Every time I closed my eyes, the scene replayed. My heart ached with a pain no doctor could heal. At first, I told myself to endure. That had been my way for years. I had endured hunger, endured long hours of labor, endured storms and struggles, all for the sake of family. But this was different. This was not weather or hardship or poverty. This was betrayal. Betrayal by the very person I gave everything to. And the more I thought of it, the more I realized endurance was no longer an option. Silence was no longer an answer. I sat thinking about my life, piece by piece. I thought of the boy I once held in my arms, carrying him to bed when he was too tired to walk. I thought of how I once cupped his little hands and poured water into them, careful not to spill, smiling when his lips touched the glass. I thought of all the nights I stayed awake watching over him, of all the days I went without so he could have more. I thought of the mansion itself, the house he now flaunted. I remembered signing the papers, remembered the pride in my chest when I handed him the keys, telling myself I had secured his future. And then I thought of that same boy, now a man, standing tall before his friends, laughing as he forced me to lower my head in shame. The contrast was unbearable. The boy I once protected now mocked me. The son I once lifted now pushed me down. The child I once gave water to now denied me a single glass unless I begged. And in that moment of memory and pain, my heart hardened. I realized something clear. If he could treat me as nothing, then I could treat him the same. If he could erase me as a father in front of strangers, then I could erase him from my legacy. It was not a decision made in anger. No, anger fades. Anger shouts, and then it grows tired. My choice was made in something deeper than anger. It was made in dignity. I told myself, I may be weak in body, I may sit in a chair with trembling hands, I may speak softly, but I am not powerless. The mansion is not his. The estate is not his. The legacy is not his. It is mine, and mine to control. And if I leave this world one day, it will not be his to inherit. That night, the decision grew stronger with every thought. I pictured myself going to my lawyer, asking him to bring out the deeds. I pictured my signature on new papers, removing my son's name completely. I pictured the shock on his face when he would discover the truth, when he would walk into the mansion and realize it was no longer his to boast about. I pictured his pride collapsing, his arrogance shattering, his laughter silenced. And strangely, I did not feel joy in that image. I felt peace. Because it was not about revenge alone. It was about restoring what he had stolen from me, my dignity. I whispered to myself in the dark, he made me beg for water. I will make him beg for shelter. Those words stayed with me, steady and clear. They were not loud, but they were final. The night stretched on, and still I did not close my eyes. I thought of the church, the place that still greeted me with respect. The people who still called me brother when my own son called me baggage. I thought of the poor, the hungry, the strangers who would be grateful for what my son only mocked. I thought of the good that could come from stripping him of arrogance and giving the wealth to those who would never laugh at an old man. The decision became more than personal. It became purposeful. By the time the first light of morning touched the window, I was no longer unsure. I was resolved. My body was weak, but my will was stronger than it had been in years. I gripped the arms of my wheelchair, lifted my head, and said quietly to myself, "It ends now." That was the decision. It was not quick, it was not easy, but it was complete. My son believed I was powerless, but he was wrong. I would not beg again, not for water, not for respect, not for dignity. My silence was over. My action was ready. The morning after I made my choice, I rose with a strength I had not felt in years. My body was frail, my legs weak, but inside me was a fire that pushed me forward. I called my lawyer, my voice steady, though my hands trembled slightly on the phone. I told him I wanted a meeting right away. He asked me if it was urgent, and I answered simply, "Yes. It is the most important thing I will ever do." He heard the weight in my voice and agreed. I wheeled myself to the car, and a kind neighbor helped me get inside. As we drove, I stared out the window, thinking of every step that had brought me here. I thought of my son's laughter, sharp and cruel, when he denied me water. I thought of my silence, of my humiliation, of the way I lowered my head in shame. I thought of the mansion, standing tall and proud, built on my sacrifice but flaunted by his arrogance. And then I thought of the papers waiting at the lawyer's office, the papers that would end it all. When I entered the lawyer's office, the air felt heavy, like a courtroom where judgment was about to be passed. He greeted me with respect, pulled out the files, and placed them before me on the table. The mansion deed, the estate documents, the legal ties that had bound my son to a future he did not deserve. He explained what I already knew, that my name was still the only one that truly mattered. My son had treated it as his, but in the eyes of the law, it was still mine. Then he asked the question, "What do you want to do?" I looked at him, my eyes clear, and I spoke without hesitation. I want to erase my son's name. I want to give the mansion away, to strangers, to anyone but him. He nodded slowly, understanding the weight of my words. He began drafting the transfer documents, each page a step closer to the justice I had longed for. The pen was placed in my hand, and my fingers wrapped around it firmly. My hand shook, but not from doubt, from the gravity of the moment. With the first stroke of ink, I felt years of pain begin to lift. I signed my name, line after line, page after page, each one cutting my son out of the future he thought was secure. The mansion was transferred, not to him, not to his friends, not to his arrogance, but to strangers, to people who needed a home, to a cause that would honor what I had built instead of mocking it. The lawyer looked at me and said, "It is done. The transfer is legal. It cannot be undone." I sat back in my chair, breathing slowly, feeling a calm I had not felt in a long time. The mansion was no longer his pride. It was no longer his toy to show off. It was gone from his hands, forever. When I left the office, the sun felt brighter, the air cleaner. I did not tell my son what I had done. I did not need to. The papers spoke louder than I ever could. My revenge was not in words or shouts. It was in ink. It was in silence. It was in finality. That was the execution. Quiet, legal, irreversible. The day my son lost the mansion he flaunted, and I reclaimed my dignity in full. It did not take long for the truth to reach him. Only a few days passed before the storm arrived. My son came home one evening, his voice loud, his laughter filling the halls as he entertained his friends. He boasted about his mansion, bragging about the rooms, the land, the value, as if he had built it with his own sweat. But when he walked through the front door with his crowd, he froze. His smile dropped. His eyes widened. For in the grand living room where he expected silence, there were strangers. Strangers walking, speaking, moving freely as though they belonged there, because now they did. I was sitting quietly in my chair when he stormed toward me, his face red with anger. "What is this? Who are these people?" he shouted. I did not answer. I only looked at him calmly. He turned back to the strangers, demanding answers, but they explained what I already knew. The deed had been transferred. The mansion was no longer his to brag about, no longer his to parade in front of friends. It belonged to others now, legal, signed, irreversible. The rage that filled him was like a storm breaking apart the walls. He shouted that it was unfair, that I had betrayed him, that I had destroyed his future. His friends stood awkwardly behind him, no longer laughing, no longer clapping, their eyes darting between us. I could feel their silence pressing down heavier than their laughter once had. They had seen him mock me. Now they saw him humiliated. He ran to his room, searching for documents, searching for proof that the house was still his. But he found nothing. Every paper, every deed, every signature had been stripped of his name. He came back down, shaking with fury, shouting that it was impossible. I looked at him with steady eyes and spoke only once. "You made me beg for water. Now you will beg for shelter." His friends whispered among themselves. Some shook their heads, others smirked, but none stood with him. The same crowd that once laughed at me now laughed at him. The mansion he had flaunted was gone. taken from under his nose. His pride was stripped bare in front of the very people he used to impress. He cursed me, cursed the strangers, cursed everyone but himself. Yet I saw the truth in his eyes. Beneath the anger was fear. Beneath the rage was shame. He knew he had brought this upon himself. And though he screamed and stomped, though he swore he would fight, the law was not on his side. The papers were sealed. The signatures were real. The mansion was no longer his. That was the fallout. His arrogance shattered, his pride collapsed, his reputation crumbled. The man who once made me beg now stood powerless, watching strangers claim the walls he thought he owned. And I, the father he mocked, sat quietly in my chair, my dignity finally restored. In the days that followed, the house no longer echoed with his laughter. The mansion was gone, and with it, his pride. He walked around the village with shoulders low, his head bent, his voice quiet. The same friends who once gathered at his side began to disappear. They no longer came to share drinks in his halls, because those halls no longer belonged to him. They no longer clapped when he mocked me, because now the joke was on him. He became a shadow of himself, no longer admired, no longer respected. I watched from a distance as the whispers began. Neighbors spoke of what had happened, how a son had forced his father to beg for water, and how that father had given away the mansion in silence. Some shook their heads in shame at him. Others smirked, saying it was justice. His reputation, once held up by arrogance, now lay in ruins. People who once praised him for his wealth now mocked him for his loss. He had built his image on money he never earned, and when that money was taken, nothing of value remained. Inside the home, the silence grew thicker. He avoided me, not out of care, but out of fear of facing the truth. He had nothing left to demand, nothing left to boast about. He looked at me sometimes with eyes that burned with hatred, but beneath it, I could see something deeper. Regret. He knew he had gone too far. He knew his cruelty had cost him everything. Meanwhile, I felt something I had not felt in years. Peace. I no longer carried the weight of humiliation. I no longer heard the laughter of his friends haunting me at night. The decision I made had restored what he tried to take away. My dignity. I could sit in silence now, not as a broken man, but as a man who had reclaimed his worth. The community treated me differently too. Where once they saw me as weak and mocked alongside him, now they looked at me with respect. Some even came to thank me, saying the gift of the mansion had changed lives, had given shelter to those who needed it, had shown the power of standing against cruelty. For the first time in a long while, I was remembered not for my weakness, but for my strength. My son, however, was remembered for something else. The boy who once laughed as his father begged now became the man who begged himself. For respect, for forgiveness, for a future that no longer existed. The mansion was gone. The pride was gone. The friends were gone. All that remained was his shame. That was the aftermath. His arrogance shattered into pieces that could never be put back together. And I, the father he mocked, found freedom in knowing I had turned humiliation into justice. In the end, justice did not come with noise. It came with silence, with ink on paper, with the steady hand of an old man who refused to beg again. My son thought he had the power when he stood before his friends and made me bow my head for water. He thought his laughter had broken me. He thought my silence meant defeat. But he forgot that silence can also mean strength, and strength does not always roar. Sometimes strength whispers. Sometimes strength waits. And when the moment comes, strength strikes without lifting a hand. He thought the mansion was his pride, his throne, his proof of worth. But he forgot the truth written in the deed. My name. My decision reminded him of that truth. With one choice, I erased his arrogance from those walls. With one stroke of a pen, I gave away everything he flaunted. He mocked me for being weak, but the weak man in the chair held more power than the proud man standing tall. That was justice. I live differently now. I walk, or rather, I roll, with dignity. My meals are quiet, but they are mine. I drink water without humiliation. I sleep without hearing laughter in my ears. The weight that once crushed my chest is gone. I am no longer the old man who begged. I am the father who stood up in silence and rewrote the ending of his own story. The mansion now belongs to others, people who needed it, people who will not use it to mock or humiliate. I have seen with my own eyes the change it brought. Children running through halls with joy, families eating together under a roof that once carried only arrogance. My sacrifice finally found its purpose, not in the hands of a cruel son, but in the lives of strangers who will remember me with gratitude, not scorn. And as for my son, he lives with nothing but memory. He cannot forget the night he made me beg. He cannot forget the day he discovered strangers walking through what he called his home. He cannot forget the silence of my eyes when I told him, "You made me beg for water. Now you will beg for shelter." That sentence will follow him longer than any shadow, because he knows it was the truth. Do I forgive him? Number. Some wounds cut too deep. Some betrayals cannot be healed. But I do not hate him either. Hatred burns the one who carries it, and I am too old to carry more weight. What I carry instead is peace. Peace knowing I balanced the scales. Peace knowing I left him not with wealth, but with the reflection of his cruelty. Peace knowing my story did not end with humiliation, but with dignity. That is my justice. He made me beg for water. I made him beg for shelter. And when I walked away, I did not look back.